Yeah, I actually come to this as a farmer, sixth generation on one side, fifth on the other, from the 1840s on. And going back through my own family's records, they went 4 months without a drop of rain in the mid-1850s, without a drop. So there was one of those unbelievably extended hot, dry summers. Soil moisture levels dropped to the point where fires were endemic. And then there was the so-called Federation drought in Australia. We've had these things before. Nonetheless, I mean, for my son and my grandson, if they want to carry on, we've got to try and make certain that we're actually able to do so. Now, farming in Australia has been proven to be unbelievably adaptive. So it seems to me that in large part, we need to recognise adaptation will be very important, but it won't be cheap. It itself will require us to be wise about what we do to our fundamental economic strength.
But again, and you're absolutely right. And look, we're both going to do adaptation. We're also going to do carbon cuts. But we should recognize what the costs are. And actually, almost everywhere, adaptation turns out, I know you said it was not going to be cheap, but it's much, much cheaper than pretty much anything else. So these are often very, very simple things. It's often things that people will do anyway. As temperatures change, you will see people change what they grow in different areas. And that's obviously one of the reasons why free trade is also incredibly important, because as the world changes in temperature, you're going to have people grow different things, different places. Overall, we're still going to be fine, but it requires us to be able to trade with each other so that places that get hotter grow different things, and we may start in places that are now too cool to grow anything, that they will start being grown typically with wheat or other coal-loving products. But the whole idea here is, again, to recognize that adaptation, absolutely. Now, cutting carbon emissions turns out to be very expensive in the short run. The EU pledged to cut carbon emissions by 20% by 2020. So we're here today and we've done that. And the academic estimates indicate that this probably cost about $400 billion every year in lost GDP.
No, that's in Europe.
That's just for Europe. And remember, the impact of Europe during this is virtually zero. We estimate for every dollar spent, the EU manages to provide climate benefits for the world worth 3 cents. That's a bad deal. And it doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway, right? It's a bad deal to spend $1 and do 3 cents of good. And if you're going to do more, if you're going to cut more, it turns out to dramatically ramp up the cost. So as more you want to cut, the more it'll cost. The cost grows exponentially. And I find it amusing. I've been telling this a number of times here when I'm in Australia, but New Zealand, as you know, have promised to go carbon neutral by 2050. Remember, they also promised that in 2008 and failed, and they promised to go carbon neutral by 2020 in 2008, and now they're, 123% above instead of being at 0%. But now they promised to do this in 2050, which is probably also a slightly more realistic time frame. But to their great credit, they've asked the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research to estimate how much will this cost. So remember, this is the government asking for an official estimate of how much will this cost. It turns out the average estimate is this will cost 16% of GDP.
Whoa.
16%. This is unheard of. Obviously twice as much as what New Zealand is spending on just on health. It's a phenomenal cost. So if you look at the actual dollar cost, it's more than what New Zealand spends on everything in the public budget today. That's a lot of money. So if you take this across the entire century, they're of course going to ramp up, and then they're going to stay on carbon neutral from 2050 to the rest of the century. If you look at that cost, using the UN's estimate for median estimate for GDP, the total cost for New Zealand will be in the order of $5 trillion. So that's $5 trillion these 5 million people will forego over the century. Then you'll say, but at least they'll do some climate good. Yes, but only if you run a climate model with and without New Zealand, the impact, the difference is that they will cut temperatures by the end of the century by 4/1000ths of a degree by the end of the century. Or to put it differently, the temperature that we would have seen in the 1st of January 2100 will now only occur on the 23rd of January 2100. I'm sorry, I can't get around to say 2100. But the fundamental point, they basically postponed global warming by about 3 weeks at the end of the century. No, I don't think most people want to spend $5 trillion doing that. And that's, of course, the underlying point, I think, for a lot of this conversation. Not only is it a bad idea, it's a bad deal. It's a poor way to help the world. But also, it is an unsustainable way. Because you cannot realistically envision asking people to forego $5 trillion and expect them to support you the next 80 years. Now, you may be able to win the next election. You may even be able to win the next after that. But most of the countries around the world will have, 20 elections over the next 80 years or something? Certainly, we will not be able to keep that going. Someone is going to come along and say, hey, wait a minute. Shouldn't we double spending on healthcare, double spending on social, double spending on environmental impact, double spending pretty much on everything, and give tax cuts and scrap this project that won't actually have any impact in 100 years? That is a very likely policy to win in the long run. That's why we need to find much better, much more effective climate policies.
I'll come back to that because you've got some interesting views on the need for major technological breakthroughs. But there's a couple of questions out of Europe there that are very, I think, important points to make. One is that the age of populism is probably coming to an end in Europe, and
What? Really?
Well,
that sounds good.
It seems to me that what you'll see is a drift towards environmentalism. The parliament's increasingly dominated by green politicians, by green politics. And the likely economic result of that will be, I would have thought, more protection, less innovation, but massive government expenditures. And those European economies are already very, very indebted. And so the problems you're talking about of voters rejecting, we've seen it in Paris, yellow vests and all the rest of it. If you can't take your people with you, governments simply will not survive. They won't be able to take the pain.
No. In that sense, I share your worry, because it's very clear that the EU has committed in a very significant way to say we're going to go green no matter what the costs.
Yeah.
And remember, we're already spending a fifth of the EU budget, admittedly a very small budget, and we're spending a lot of resources. So we're committed to things that will cost us close to $1 trillion. So overall, for climate policies by 2030, we'll see, some estimates indicate that we'll quadruple the electricity prices, which are already as high as the Australian, which are much, much higher than elsewhere. I worry that we may, in some ways, get stuck in a place where it's really, really hard to get rid of those sorts of policies.
Yes.
So in some sense, you could see, because I was a little surprised when you said that populism is coming to an end. But yes, I recognize that we're increasingly switching towards green populism. Oh, we're going to fix all your problems by cutting carbon emissions, and we're all going to feel good and warm and fuzzy. We're of course going to freeze, but we're at least going to feel good about ourselves. But the reality is that will, as you point out, probably leave us a lot less well off than we would otherwise be. Now, the reality is that unless you get everyone on the planet, or at least all the major parts of the world along with us, we're not going to solve global warming through these sorts of policies. And in that sense, it seems to me that the EU is going to be pretty much alone out there in the front. We're going to have a situation where is India or China going to accept significantly lower growth rates in order to fix climate change? Probably not. America seems to be going in the same way. Africa obviously have many other and much more urgent issues. Latin America, I'm not quite as sure on. But the reality here is that as long as our solution is it's going to cost you a lot and it's going to be a lot of pain. You're unlikely to solve the problem. And that's why I say, look, we got to find a better and smarter policy. So what we've looked at, so we did a similar sort of exercise, but instead of for the world, we did it just for climate. So a prioritization of all the different climate policies you can make. We did it together with 27 of the world's top climate economists, with 3 Nobel laureates in economics, to look at where can you spend $1 and do the most climate good. So we don't care in this exercise about malaria or anything else. We're just looking at where can you do the most good for climate. And what we found was, don't do the sort of Kyoto, Paris kind of agreements, because they fundamentally, they cost a lot and they only deliver a little bit of benefit. The best long-term solution is to invest dramatically more in green energy research and development. So fundamentally, the idea is to say, if you can innovate the price of new green energy down below fossil fuels, we've solved global warming. Everyone will switch. You don't need any, these many, many meetings from Copenhagen and Paris and Kyoto to twist people's arms and tell them to do stuff that's going to be costly. They will do it because it's cheaper. If we don't get that technological breakthrough, it's going to be hard all the way. And so if you'll allow me just to give you a simple sort of metaphor, if we think back to the 1970s or late 1960s, a lot of people worried about, would we be able to feed the world? And the sense was a little bit, I remember my mom doing this. I never got the logic of that. You got to finish your plate because, there's all these hungry kids down in Africa. And I was totally unsure of how those two things were related. But the idea, of course, is in some ways to say, look, if you eat a little less, and if we all eat a little less, and then we send a little more down to Africa, then maybe they'll suffer a little less. Could you please, stop eating so much? Could you please not have it so good? And then we'll probably help them a little bit. That's a really, really hard sell. And of course, that was not what actually solved the problem in Africa and elsewhere. The solution was the Green Revolution that we managed through technology and, as we talked about before, about much higher yielding varieties, to actually let those countries feed themselves. Surprisingly, India was actually, it was not Africa back then, it was much more India. Yeah. We worried about. India now is the world's biggest rice exporter. Now, part of it is because they use their water unsustainably. There's a lot of things you can still quibble about, but the fundamental point is to recognize that you can do with technology what you cannot really do with suffering. You can't ask everyone, I'm sorry, could you suffer for the rest of the century? And everybody else will promise to do the same, and then we'll probably do something about global warming. That's never going to work. What you can do is to say, why don't we go away, discover this great energy source that's actually green and cheaper, and then let everyone have it. Now, I'm not saying this is easy, and I'm not saying I have that solution because then I'd just be incredibly rich. But the point is, if we could innovate that, and we do that through government R&D, if we dramatically increased our investment in government R&D, we could drive those innovations that over the next half century would actually come up with the solutions that would power the rest of the 21st century.
Did you enjoy this conversation? To keep up to date with new episodes, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell.